you everybody for attending. Thank you for the program committee for having me. I will skip doing the introduction, any further introductions for myself, because it's really not about me. It's about a topic that I'm interested in from a research perspective, but I wanted to share some insight and some findings as I've been working in this area. So let me start this way, if I could. How many of you already know what an ASN is, just by show of hands? You know what it stands for, you have a rough idea. How many of you have used an ASN in the context, you've configured a router and set up BGP peering with an ASN? Okay, a few less. How many have your own ASN? Okay, about the same number. Okay, that's about what I expected. Those are my networking people, very good. So here's roughly what I'm going to try to do for the next maybe 25 or so minutes. I do hope to leave some time at the end, because what it's really not about me and necessarily the topic that I want to present to you. It's maybe somewhat about the topic, but I'm really interested in your reaction to it. So I hope that if you have questions or comments that you will come up to the mic and share them with me. And if you want to have a discussion afterwards, I'll be here all week, and I really look forward to discussing this with you further. So this is somewhat shaped a little bit in the sense of how I might write an academic paper. I'll take you through a little bit of a background material, some of the data sources of what I'm working with. And the analysis part will probably be the most useful or interesting part in this talk, and we'll spend maybe a good portion of the time on that. And then sort of towards the end, I'll just kind of quickly suggest maybe some discussion topics and some future work in this area, and leave you some references and contact information. So first of all, before I really dig into the idea of what new ASNs are, let me start this way, and to make sure that some of you who maybe aren't that familiar with what an ASN is, or BGP in particular, let me spend just a few moments on that. What are these things? How do we use them? How do you get them? So before there was BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol, which really does drive internet routing today, there was an earlier version of a routing protocol called EGP, Exterior Gateway Protocol. And the concept of an ASN actually derives from this period, which in 1982, when this RFC was written, probably even predates some of you, even haven't been born, I suspect. This is a long time ago. It predates not you, I know, but it predates my involvement in the internet. This was a long time ago for probably most of us, even those of us who may have been alive. Pay attention, in particular, this quote, the 16-bit identification number. That is the size of the ASN that existed up until relatively recently. The size of the ASN now is 32 bits, but that's a relatively new development in terms of the internet lifetime. Interestingly, the transition from 16 to 32-bit wasn't so difficult. It wasn't a process that we're going through now with IPv4 to v6. It was much easier to go from 16-bit to 30-bit ASNs, and we're not going to spend any time talking about that transition and how that all works. But note that did occur. 16 bits allows you a number space of about a little over 65,000 numbers. And as a preview, in ASN, these numbers are used to essentially associate with a, quote, network. So we have reached the size of the internet where there is more than that many networks that need that number. So a 32-bit was absolutely necessary. Now, we can't spend a lot of time talking about routing and having a class on routing, so just kind of do this really quick on one page. This leaves out a lot, and it simplifies quite a bit. But if we were to talk about BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol, from a routing perspective, really its main function is to exchange reachability information, which in the world of IP networking says, here's a block of IP addresses, or here's a set of different IP prefixes. If you want to reach these addresses, you can reach them through me. I'm advertising that fact that I'm a relay for those addresses. That's what BGP is used to do, is to exchange that information amongst other BGP-speaking routers. Each BGP router or each network has a number associated with it. That's sort of the aggregate of all the addresses grouped under that number is called the autonomous system number. So that's BGP in a nutshell. That's probably the quickest BGP class you've probably ever had. It's very woefully insufficient, but that's all we really have time for today. Now, what's an ASN? This is maybe a little bit more important. We can maybe spend a little bit more time on ASNs for this talk. So let me just break this up in the three terms that make up this acronym. One, the autonomous part is really this independent self-managed thing, this entity, this network, this subsystem. It's not necessarily reliant on any external third party. Anything that goes on within this autonomous system is all developed and managed by one organizing party, institution, group, or individual. The system part is essentially a collection of hardware, software, protocols, and anything that you might literally build a network with. But usually the computer components, more or less. And then the number part is simply just a unique identifier. Although unique may be a misnomer depending on context, it's not necessarily always unique, but at least in the context of internet routing, there's a unique number that identifies every network on the internet, and everyone has their own number. Now, how would you get an ASN? It's actually, for many people, may be surprised to learn, it's relatively easy to get. But there's a process and a hierarchy, normally, that you would get your number from if you wanted one. Most of you, if you wanted one, might either get one from your local internet registry, which in many cases is your upstream ISP. You can get it from them, potentially. Probably the majority of networks will get their own number from what's called their regional internet registry. I assume most of you, or at least have been exposed to the term regional internet registry, and you probably know your own regional internet registry, and I've listed them here. AFRINIC, which roughly covers the Africa continent. APNIC, which is more or less Asia-Pacific area. AREN, which is largely North America, Canada, and the US. And a few surrounding properties, somewhat legacy perhaps, but that are associated with North America. LACNIC is largely all South America, Central America. And RIPE, of course, is Europe and a few surrounding places like the Middle East and things like that. So it's not a perfect representation geographically, but those 5 Rs exist. And they're more or less the authoritative source of the ASN numbers. But they actually get their numbers from a parent called IANA. And IANA is really the ultimate the peak of the hierarchy in this context. And IANA, of course, is a function that's driven through ICANN of the internet system. So that's kind of in the hierarchy of where they came from. But how might you actually use an ASN? What we really use ASNs is for routing. That's its main function, going all the way back to 1982 when it was eBGP. So if you had a Cisco router, you might have a configuration that looks kind of like this. So if you've used Cisco IOS before, this should look relatively familiar to you. This is a very simple example. It's not a real example. It's sort of made up. But there's 2 AS numbers that are actually part of this config. On the first line, where it says router BGP 49152, that's the local AS number of that router itself, of that network. And then you can see there's a neighbor statement. And the remote AS, the remote autonomous system, that's a peer that you're connecting to. You're going to exchange some routing information with, that's their AS number. So this is more or less what you do in routers. You configure basically your side with your AS number, and you configure the remote side's AS number. So this is a very simple example of what exists all over the place in internet routers. But it's relatively easy to set up and do. This is a very simple example. There's usually a lot more statements in here that do all kinds of like filtering and other things, but this more or less would work. If you want to look at a routing table, that's a BGP routing table, it might look something like this. It may be a little bit, it's actually not too bad. I think most of you can probably see that in the back if it's not too small. But when you look at a routing table, you see the AS number in different perspectives. You'll see maybe a summary section up top. This is looking at it with the help of route views, which is a system I'll mention again. And it shows you the networks or the peers that you're connected to, and it's saying which AS number that you're peered with, so 3356, 7018. Those are the peers of this router. And then down below, you're looking at an actual route announcement for a particular prefix. In this case, it's Google's Quad 8 address. And you can see I've highlighted or bolded down below the AS numbers as they exist in a couple of places. The first one where it says 708 space 15169, that's the AS path. The AS numbers are used to construct a path of a prefix from one network to the next as it's seen by each router. So that's the AS path you may have heard about. And then down below, you see the AS numbers appear again in something that's called community tags. This is sort of auxiliary information for a route. You see this sometimes that a network may attach some kind of information about a prefix or a set of routes, and it will do that by first prepending its own AS followed by some other code. Codes can represent all kinds of things, like how to handle this route. Like, I want you to not export this route to any of your other neighbors or something like that. So we won't get into all the details of routing, but there's a quick look at what it might look like from the perspective of an actual router. In this case, it's a Cisco-looking router. Now, who uses these? I hope this is relatively obvious by now, but routers use these. Those that speak with BGP will. But really, ultimately, more fundamentally, is anyone who wants to receive internet routes directly, participate in the routing system, you need to use BGP. And for that, if you want to actually enter into a peering relationship, you need to have an ASN number to be able to do that. As well, if you want to actually update the internet routing table, when you update the internet routing table, included in your update is at least your origin AS of where that prefix comes from. And then it'll be included in the full path as it makes its way through all the other routers on the internet. There's a couple other places we might use ASNs. One somewhat lesser known is this glop IP multicast addressing scheme. This probably means nothing to almost everybody here. This isn't widely used anymore, but it was kind of a novel little trick if when you were doing IP multicast and you wanted to use a set of multicast addresses on the global internet, we didn't easily have a way of getting our own block of addresses to associate with our own applications. So they came up with a way to say, if you have a 16-bit AS number, there's a method by which you can construct a block of addresses based on your AS number. So you would sometimes see those addresses in the multicast address tables, and you could see where they originated from because the ASN was encoded within the second and third octet. But I don't think really many people use that anymore. And of course, all of us in this room are probably either some sort of researcher, measurement, or incident responder. If you're an incident responder, you probably use ASs all the time for looking at data feeds and reports that you get that associate with which network some IP address is associated with it, so you know who to relay abuse alerts to and those sorts of things. You may not use an ASN directly in the sense of routing, but you may use it to organize your abuse reports for your constituents. And then lastly, maybe this is somewhat a bit out of order, but the allocation for the ASN itself and the assignment will, as I mentioned, tends to flow down from IANA down to ultimately the registrant, if it's you or the network that you operate. You may get an assignment directly from IANA. That's not very common. That's used for special assignments typically. But you may or may not use an IRR or an LRR to get your assignment. There are some special and reserved ASNs that are in use. It's kind of anomalous to bogan IP addresses, if you're familiar with bogan IP addresses. Although we don't tend to worry about bogan ASNs as much, you sometimes will see them appear in the routing tables, and they shouldn't in the public internet routing tables. So some people will filter out bogan ASNs. And that, if you're not doing that, you might consider doing that yourselves. ASNs are often transferred around, companies go out of business, or they get taken over or merge with another company, and sometimes ASNs get updated with their contact information. So ASNs are not a static number, just like IP addresses are not. They're not necessarily as mobile or frequently exchanged as IP address blocks, perhaps, but it's not uncommon for ASNs to migrate. And perhaps surprisingly, it's really easy and cheap to get an ASN. In some regions more so than others. In the AREN region, you do have to be an organization to get a ASN number or any resource from AREN. In RIPE, it's a little easier and a little cheaper, although I think they raise the prices a little bit. I've often seen individuals who are just sort of getting into the computer world and they've got an AS number and then they post on a forum like, okay, I have this AS number, what do I do with it? Like some people are just getting ASNs because it seems cool to them and don't know what to do with it. I'm not too crazy about seeing those people. I'm afraid what they might do with it, but I think they're clueless enough generally that they're really not much of a threat. But to point out that it can be very easy to get them. And anytime any resource is easy and cheap to get, it could be a potential avenue for abuse. So the data that I'm using to look at so-called new ASNs is really this set, and it's not a complete set, it's just what I'm using for this talk. For routing information, there's lots of sources, but the two big ones that are well known are from RIPE, from their routing information service, and route views. They have a historical collection of routing data. They basically take dumps and snapshots of routing tables every few hours, and they archived them going back to like 2000 or the early 2000s, so you have tons and tons of routing data. So that's a great resource. I make use of that. The IRR databases, this is the set of information about who has registered ASNs or any resource. the databases from the IRRs are generally publicly available. You can get access to those. That'll provide you contact information, maybe something about who the organization is. Those are freely available, so I'll use that stuff. And then somewhat lesser known perhaps, and not necessarily always widely available, in the case of DDoS mitigation data, I'm affiliated with an organization that does DDoS mitigation, and so I have access to all sorts of alert data, and we know about attacks, and then I can do some association based on who the attack's going towards or coming from. So I'm using some of that in this presentation. And then DataPlane, which is the organization I'm representing here, has a large low-impact honeypot network, and so we see all kinds of traffic unsolicited from clients and targeting all kinds of hosts, and so we're looking at that data as well. And the last thing, which is perhaps maybe even the most novel part into the analysis phase, is using the Spamhaus ASN drop list. If you're not familiar with this, they reintroduced it just about a year ago. You should check it out. You may or may not want to block networks as a group based on ASN, but if you did want to, or if you were curious about which ASNs might be ones for you to really take a look at to see if you're seeing any traffic to or from, this is a good list to go download and put into your data set and see if you have any matches. So the first plot I want to show you is just a trend of ASNs as they appear in a BGP route announcement for 2024. The blue line is really kind of the interesting one here. This blue line is just showing you the total number of unique autonomous system numbers that appear as an origin AS in the routing tables in the last year. And you can see it's a slow progression, but it's up and to the right, that the number of ASNs is slowly increasing. It's about 75,000. It's about 80,000 today, maybe a little bit less. But it's slowly increasing. But that's a pretty big number, and if you remember, this is larger than a 16-bit number, so we did need that 32-bit number now to be able to accommodate this. The orange line is just a cumulative number. Sometimes ASNs aren't always, they don't stick around. They're not always in the routing tables, and so there's a clear discrepancy there, that there's a lot more ASNs that are allocated, but they're not actually showing up in routing tables all the time. Now, you may have been wondering about that little dip in that blue spot. And this isn't really particular to this talk, but there was an internet shutdown event in Bangladesh last year, right around that time. The country had I don't know if it was like a political event or some, maybe it had something to do with school exams or something, I don't remember. But most of the mobile carriers all basically shut down their internet connections, and so the ASNs that would originate routes from Bangladesh essentially went offline, so that's why that dip is there. So I just showing you that you can see patterns like that very easily when you look at routing tables and look for the unique number of ASNs per day. If we look at the difference between ASNs as they are assigned, so you may have an ASN from an IRR versus when it actually gets used in the routing system that is in BGP, there's a real clear difference here. The orange line shows the origin ASNs as they're appearing in the routing tables. These are new ASNs that have been registered in 2024. You can see them roughly starts at 0, but it goes up to about 3,000 by the end of the year. But there's actually about 6,000 new ASNs assigned for the year 2024. So only about a half of them actually get put into use, at least as an origin ASN. So that's a pretty big difference. Why aren't these people using them? Well, maybe they are, we just don't see them. They might be using them internally. Maybe they're just holding on to them for future use. We may not necessarily know unless we dig into this a little bit further or just ask them. But you can see there's clearly both a trend to the right, but there's a huge gap here in usage and assignment. So let's talk about DDoS attacks. So I looked to see how quickly a new ASN that was assigned would be attacked. So you get your ASN from your regional internet provider. How long until you start seeing attacks? The median time, or the mean time, was about 3.5 months, almost 4 months, which is not too long. It's maybe longer than you might expect if you just plug a host into the internet. You usually see scan traffic right away. But for us to see a DDoS attack alert, and I'm not really saying anything about the size of the attack, it may be relatively small and inconsequential, but an alert that we see is usually something. It's usually something to note. Will happen, within a few months. And for all the ones that we do see, we'll see them eventually. But of all the ones we see of the new ASNs, it's about maybe 10 20% of new ASNs. From the time when a new ASN actually gets announced, this interval is much shorter, right? If you actually starting announcing the prefix, the attacks just come a little bit sooner. So this graph is just a little steeper at the beginning, but this essentially shows a similar sort of pattern. Let me just back up and point out, if I may, I meant to mention back here, sorry, this is a little slow. This plot here, the orange line, you can see it actually starts just above 0. You do see some new ASNs announced before they're actually even assigned. Why that is, I'm not quite sure. I haven't looked into that yet. It may be someone is announcing bogon ASNs before they were actually registered, or someone who was eager and trying to latch onto an ASN that doesn't exist and take it over. But that does happen too. So the DDoS mitigation provider space is just a summary of what we see. We see just a proportion. We don't see everything. But we see, I think, enough sample size to be able to see something useful. About 10% of the new ASNs that are routed will have received a DDoS attack. It's a little harder to know if they've been a source of an attack due to spoofing, but I can estimate about 25% of new ASNs are seemingly involved in attacks. And that's not an insignificant number either. But I hope it's not too unsurprising. A new network comes online, new systems maybe not configured, patched, secured, not really prepared to be on the internet for the first time. That's kind of what that's saying. When we look at our sensor networks, I took a look at just one particular service, SSH listeners. Do we see brute force password attempts from networks that are new ASNs? And the way I counted this first, I totaled up 15 million unique events. That's basically a password attempt from new ASNs. I thought, wow, that's kind of a lot. And that's just what we see. We only see a very small portion of the internet. However, I realized the way I counted was not right. I basically took data for a year, and I took the addresses and I mapped them to what ASN was originating them in the routing table. I said, oh yeah, there's 15 million of these new ASNs are involved. But if I actually went back and said, well, what time of year, what was the day that this event happened? Let's say it was in March. Well, this address was actually sometimes associated with a different ASN. It wasn't a new ASN, it was just some other one. Sometimes address blocks move around quite a bit these days due to address leasing. And some of the new ASNs are getting these somewhat mobile, volatile network address blocks. You might say kind of dirty. And so they may or may not actually have been responsible for this activity, this scanning attempts. In fact, a significant amount of the time they weren't, 33% of the time. So I found that to be quite interesting and compelling. And I more or less just said all that there. And then lastly, this is perhaps a little bit to make out each individual one, but you're not meant to see each individual line. But what this is representing is taking a look at when an ASN was assigned in 2004. And so for the blue lines on this graph, the leftmost point of that blue line is when an ASN was assigned. And then the line extends all the way to the right, and at some point may stop, and when it stops, or if it extends all the way to the end, that's when the Spamhaus ASN drop list had created an entry for it. So there was about 60 ASNs that we classified as new, that Spamhaus identified as having some sort of problem and they want them on the block list. So you can see when they were assigned to when they were blocked. If they go all the way to the end of the year, they were probably blocked sometime in 2025, so it actually goes a little further. There's two lines here that are kind of interesting, these two orange lines that are in the middle. If you're colorblind, it's the different color. And it starts in kind of the opposite order. They appeared on the Spamhaus ASN drop list, and then they appeared to be registered later. That's kind of curious. What happened there? Was Spamhaus like they just knew this was coming? No, what actually happened in these two cases was that the ASN had been transferred from somebody else. So it existed with some other network that they had listed before, and then it got reassigned to somebody else, and the new assignment was one that ultimately ended up being a subject to this block list. Maybe the new assignment shouldn't be on the block list. It actually turns out in these two cases the transfer was more or less to the same organizations, just oddly enough. So they had the block, I think, still applies in these two cases, but that was just kind of an interesting phenomenon. If you look at it from the perspective of when a ASN was announced in the routing table to when they ended up in the Spamhaus ASN drop list, times tend to be a little bit shorter. They tend to catch it kind of right away. You know, traffic happens, Spamhaus is really good about catching it. So many of the lines are quite a bit shorter here. You can see the mean time from BGP announcement time to drop is, you know, less than 3 months. And in many cases, it's even just a few days. I more or less said this, so I'm going to kind of skip over this. And this is kind of my closing slide. So the last bit of work and an area where I'm kind of looking at now is what's the profile of these new networks, these new ASNs? Who do they connect to? Who are their upstream providers? Who are their peers? And this was actually quite interesting. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into what some of these numbers represent, but each of these numbers represent a different network. The ones that are in bold tend to be bigger networks. They tend to be a concentration point, so they're probably bigger providers that are providing upstream service for a new ASN. Some of these numbers you may or may not recognize. I certainly recognize some of them. And it's interesting which of the big networks seem to show up a lot. There's some networks that are just more popular with new ASNs. And that's kind of an interesting thread of research of where I'm sort of taking this. And so I'd be very interested to talk to some of you about this in more detail, because I think there's a lot to say here that I could just explain by this mesh plot. So this is kind of where we're headed. We're interested in the reputation of networks, you know, not only in who they connect to, but in a broad sense, you know, even maybe how they change and evolve over time. But this is more or less where I'm going to end, and I think I have maybe just a few minutes for questions. You know, where do we take this for actionable insight? What can you do with information about new ASNs, profiling them, or maybe you want to operate on them like newly observed domain names. Maybe you look at them more closely than other legacy ASNs that have been around for a long time. So I'm interested in hearing ideas from you about that. So here's some resources, some of that I've used, I've mentioned, just some general links that you may find useful. The slide deck is widely available already on my homepage. It'll be available for you first. So I will leave you with my contact information and any Q&A that we might have time for. So Thomas, I'll put it back to you.
Yeah, so if you have questions, please make your way to the microphones. In the meantime, we'll like to thank John for his interesting presentation on new ASNs.
Anyone approaching the mic?
Don't be shy.
2 points. First of all, I think the main reason for new ASNs probably is companies going multi-homed.
Companies going, I'm sorry.
Multi-homed. Because if you're going from a single connection to redundant connection to 2 ISPs, you need to get an ASN. That's usually the common reason why there are going to be new ASNs. So that's very non-malicious reason for.
That's the traditional reason to get an ASN, but there are other reasons that we're seeing as well. Yes.
So second question is actually not for you, for the audience. Can you get a raise of hands of people who actually block on the network level based on the ASNs?
I'll repeat in case people didn't hear that. Do you block based on ASN at your network level? Who does that? Just raise your hands. Maybe about a dozen people. Who here knew about the Spamhaus ASN drop list by show of hands? Okay, about the same number of people.
Hi, thank you very much for a technical talk. I like that. Can you just mention what kind of malicious activities does one do with an ASN? I mean, you have probably route hijacking, DDoSing. Are there any other activities?
Well, maybe one of the most interesting things in the context of being a new ASN is what we sometimes see is, it seems to come from a particular region of the world, but malicious actors are setting up networks and registering ASNs as their own network as almost, it seems like a point of deflection. So if I build a network and I have some malicious activity, I might also build another network over here with a new ASN. So when this one gets blocked by you all, or the ASN spam house list, I have this other one ready to go. And then there's another ASN that provides upstream service that doesn't actually originate any IP addresses. That might be a new ASN well. So it seems to be kind of a diversionary tactic to provide this sense of resiliency and redundancy for some of these malicious actors. I think that's kind of an interesting phenomenon that's been happening in the last decade or so.
I think why there aren't a lot of hands for the blocking ASNs is most firewalls don't support it. I've trust me, my enhancement requests are like 8 years old. And network engineers are pretty reluctant to just start messing with BGP.
Yep.
And the European Union sanctioned Stark Industries 2 months ago, ASN 44477. Did you see that in your data set?
Yeah, I think there's a real discrepancy here by being able to block on ASN, because normally when you block something with your firewalls, your routers, you're doing it on a per packet basis, right? ASN doesn't show up in a packet in traffic, right? So you have to have some mapping that you've built into your routers and firewalls that's hopefully continuously updating that association of IP addresses to ASNs, so you could even block by ASNs. So I think, to go to your point, I think that's probably part of the problem, is the products haven't really been maybe very good or been built to necessarily do that. But we do see it, and we saw another research project I was involved in was looking at the sanctions as they were applied to Russia. And many of you, I assume, have to know that within the European Union, there were some stipulations where networks were essentially required to block certain Russian media organizations like RT and Sputnik News and things. And we saw some blocking based on the AS level there. Not a lot, but a little bit. I don't know if that answered your question, but I tried to answer the best I could.
Cool, thanks. Did you do some correlation, like ASN's organization where it's registered and malicious activity that you saw? Like did you see some clusters?
So yes, a little bit. I didn't show a whole lot. There was maybe a little bit of a hint in that plot there to some degree. But like the DDoS attack mitigation data, we could definitely see some patterns of new networks who were showing up. In one case, there was one network that had like a single /24, but was responsible for a huge disproportionate amount of attack traffic. So I've been doing a little bit of that. I maybe didn't show you too much of that, unfortunately. But that is work in progress for sure. And there's other things to look at from reputation perspective, and not just attack, but like the geolocation databases are an interesting phenomenon too, because who are they associated with and where, I think, is another interesting avenue that hopefully you'll see some more work from me in that area. I think that's all I could
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone want to be the last one? No?
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to our speaker.